All right, everybody give a round of applause for Carrie.
And because Raymond hasn't set the clock, I'm just going to take as long as I want to. So I'm a visiting professor here at Kyushu University, but I am based in Germany usually at the Universität des Saarlandes. And I think I'll start out with a little story about me. That's me, and that's some guy. And whenever I meet people and I tell them, I'm a linguist, they always ask me, how many languages do you speak? And I hate that. I hate it because asking a linguist how many languages she speaks is like asking a doctor, how many diseases do you have? Or asking a marine biologist, how many whales do you have? Or asking a theologian, how many religions do you practice? Because what a linguist does, and I think most of us already know this by now at the end of the evening, we describe how languages work, what they're made up of. We look at their sounds, we look at their words, we look at their grammars. We can compare languages across, different language families, all that kind of thing. We don't necessarily speak a bunch of languages. But I am a psycholinguist. So I like to look at the psychological processes that go on when we use language. So I'm going to psychoanalyze you tonight. So I think we'll start with a little trick. And I need my cheat sheet here because I kind of forget. Oh no, did I lose it? Oh God. All right. So I need my little cheat sheet here. So I'm going to ask you to answer a couple of questions. It's going to start out with a little bit of math, but it's easy math. I know you're here for language. You're definitely not interested in mathematics. Oh, some of us are not interested in mathematics. And this is taken from a really fun video that I saw on the internet quite a few years ago. And a friend of mine sent me something similar and said, oh my God, how does this work? So let me demonstrate. All right. So first, I want you to pick a number between 1 and 10. Any number. Okay? And I want you to keep your answers to yourself. So don't tell your neighbors. If you need to, you can write it down and use your calculators, but it is pretty simple. But keep your answers to yourself. So you have a number between 1 and 10. Now I want you to multiply that by 2. Okay? Now I want you to add 8. Okay? Now divide that number by 2.
Wait, you slow it down. Multiply.
We'll go back. Okay, so a number between 1 and 10. Okay? Multiply that by 2. Don't let anyone see. Okay. Add 8. Divide by 2. Now subtract your original number.
Same number.
Cool. But keep your answers to yourself. All right. Now I want you to think of the alphabet, the Latin alphabet, and I want you to find a letter that corresponds to your number. So if you have 1, it's A, 2 is B, 3 is C, 4 is D, and so on. Okay? You have your letter? Now, without saying anything, I want you to think of a country that starts with that letter. Okay? Now, I want you to go one letter over. So if you had A, you're at B. If you had B, you're at C. Okay? One letter over. And I want you to think of an animal that starts with that letter. Okay. Now, this animal has a particular color, and I want you to think of that color. Are any of you thinking of gray elephants from Denmark?
Yes.
You freak. So that's what Gamer Boy does here on the internet. And I picked the cleanest comments I could find from the video. But like, oh my God, I picked gray elephant from Denmark. This is so cool. And people totally freak out. So, and it's been repeated on various websites. This guy can read your mind will be blown. And I first came across this many years ago when a friend sent me an email. This is 20 years ago. We had email, but we didn't have memes yet. And she said, oh my God, how does this work? And basically it was a trick where you do a bunch of math questions, and then you're asked to name a color, name a tool. And people think of red hammer first. And they're like, what? And my friend wanted to know how this works. And as a linguist, especially a psycho one, I was like, it's word frequency, right? So it's a trick. No matter what number you started with the 1 to 10 business, you always end up with the number 4. right? If you did the math correctly, and that's why I didn't want you to tell anybody, because somebody would have said, wait, she started with 3 and I started with 6, we both have 4, what? So no matter what, you're gonna end up with D, right? As long as you're, mathing, right? And the thing is, there's not many countries that start with the letter D. And especially if you're North American or European, Denmark is gonna be the first thing you come up with, unless you're pretentious, right? I'm kidding, if any of you are pretentious, that's great. So most people are gonna say Denmark, right? Something similar with E, right? There's not a lot of animals that begin with E. Elephant is one of them, and it's also the most frequent animal word of that set. But with animals, we also have the concept of prototypicality. So prototypicality means, does it look like other animals? So most animals have a body and 4 legs, right? That's your general basic animal shape. And when I was playing this game with a colleague of mine earlier this week, the first thing she said was, eel. Oh wait, eels aren't animals. I'm like, they probably are, but they are not prototypical animals, right? So this whole little game kind of tricks you into, coming up with a very specific answer. And like, I can read your mind. And if you go to the YouTubes and you put in psychopath test, you might find a variation of this. I find them most interesting to read for the comments. They're definitely not safe for work. They're pretty great. But whilst we're talking about frequency and prototypicality, I thought I would take a little segue, and this is why I might go over time, but I just thought it was really interesting. So when I was doing my master's degree, I had a professor of psycholinguistics, and probably like a lot of students, I loved the segues more than I loved the actual lecture. And in one of his lectures, I kind of forget what it was about, but he mentioned the concept of category-specific semantic impairments. I thought that was the craziest thing I ever heard of, and I ended up doing my PhD on this. So I thought about this for like 5 years. It was fascinating. So with a category-specific semantic impairment, the kinds that I studied, what you do is you have patients who have some sort of brain damage. It's usually a brain infection like brain herpes and encephalitis. And they've lost their knowledge for non-living things. They're like, I can't describe that, I don't know what that is anymore. But they're okay for living things, or vice versa. And that's as much as my professor said about it. He wasn't an expert in it. And I just thought, that's the weirdest thing I ever heard. What the hell? And it's definitely not the case that we have like animals over here and tools over here. That's not how it works. So I wondered, how the hell does that work? But I'll tell you what the patients kind of look like. So one of the most well-known studies of these types is Warrington and Chalice. And they presented several patients. I have JBR and SBY here for you. And if you can read this, I'll read the key examples always. But JBR, when he was asked what a tent was, he was able to describe it well. He said it's a temporary outhouse living home. Great, better than I could probably do. When he was asked what a torch was, because this was in England, Britain, in it. So he was like, Americans would be like, torch, that's different. But he was in England, and he said a torch is a handheld light. All very good stuff, right? SBY was also fine, wheelbarrow, object used by people to take material about, everything's good. But then, when they were asked about animals, clear breakdown. So JBR was shown a daffodil, and he looked at it and he's like, plant? One of my favorites is when he was shown a snail, he said insect animal. He couldn't really give any details about this. Same thing with SBY. He was asked about wasps, and he said bird that flies. They really just didn't know what these things were anymore. And I just found this absolutely fascinating. In another study, there's only, I think, a handful of studies. I think, oh God, the last time I thought about this, which is 20 years ago, there's only about 100 case studies. It is extremely rare. I will say, after studying this for 5 years, I got really paranoid of like, how likely am I to get this? Extremely unlikely. But in another study, they were testing their patients, and they had them draw objects. So for this patient, they did what's called immediate copying. So that means the patient has the image right next to them, and they just draw whatever that image is, right? You can see this guy does a great job. The rhinoceros, fantastic. I couldn't do that if I was looking at a rhinoceros, absolutely not. But then they did delayed copying. So this is now drawing the animal from memory. And this is what happened. And you get a 4-legged duck. And this 4-legged duck is like burned into my brain. And I'm so glad for the internets now that I could easily find this image, because I read this paper years and years ago, well, obviously years ago. But you ended up with a four-legged duck, but it makes a lot of sense. Because what happens with this semantic knowledge breakdown is our knowledge of things is made up of features, how we interact with them, right? What they look like, what they smell like, what they sound like, that kind of thing. And in these kind of impairments, the thing that's most likely to go are the distinctive features. And the things that stay are the prototypical or shared features, the high frequency features, right? So this man, he knew like a duck's an animal, animals have a body and four legs. Nah, look, that's a duck, right? But pretty crazy stuff. So frequency is really, really important in psychology and linguistics. We're gonna move along. So, you know, I'm a linguist, but I'm also a human person, and I spend time on the internet, and I see magical things. I'm going to show you another thing, and this, the first time I saw it was 20 years ago. Again, we didn't have memes. It was an email. You had to scroll down and read the email. I'm going to show it to you. Probably a lot of you in the room are very familiar with this. So I just want you to have a look and have a read, and we'll talk about it. You've seen it? Yeah. All right, have you all seen this before? Yeah. So like the crazy thing is I was actually studying at Cambridge when I saw this, and I knew like a bunch of linguists. I'm like, yeah, that's not what we're doing. How many of you believe this was true at one point? You did think, oh yeah, that's how we read. Coolio. Oh no. Can you read that? Nope, you can't. That's because I created this with a random text generator, so you have no context whatsoever, but I followed the principles, and I mixed up the words the way that magical text said you could, right? First letter, last letter, but you can't read that, right? So I thought I'll tell you how you actually read, right? So I call this my Cambridge reading conundrum. And basically with the Cambridge text, it's highly predictable, right? There's a lot of context there. It makes it really easy to read. If we were really able to read up, jumbled up like words and letters like that, we could read random texts, and we can't. And also in the Cambridge text, the function words. So function words are going to be your determiners like and the, your prepositions on, at, through, right? So these are largely preserved because they're short in English. So you have like sort of like a basic, you know, sentence shape, and you just have to fill in some nouns and verbs, and you're golden. Also in the Cambridge text, the vocabulary is relatively simple. I play this game with my students back home in Germany, and you know, German, long words. And my non-native English-speaking German students find it much easier to read the English version of this text than they do the German version, right? So it's cheating on so many different levels. And another thing about the Cambridge text, there's no anagrams. The number jumbles don't create like any new words. So that text is cheating quite a bit, right? And the thing that frustrates me about it is people think, oh, that's how we read. No, it's not. So are you ready to be messed with again? Alrighty, so I'm gonna give you another text. And this time, I want you to read the text, but as you read, I want you to count the number of letter Fs, okay? You can just kind of like do it on your, like, whatever. I want you to read the text, though, counting the Fs. If you notice that you missed an F, don't go back. Just keep on going forward, right? And I'm going to ask you for your final total of Fs at the end. Okay. Are you ready? All right, you better do this fast because time is ticking, okay? All right. Are you done? All right. How many Fs? 22? 31? How many? 30? Okay. I'm gonna make a confession. Again, the first time I saw this text, I saw it as an email because it was 20 years ago. But it was a little bit shorter, and there was a total of 24 Fs. And like, it says like, read the text, and you scroll through the email, it says like, how many did you find? You scroll through, and it says, haha, there's 24. I'm like, what? Because I found 17, and I'm like, maybe I'm kind of dumb, I don't know. There is, in fact, 33. But what happens is native speakers especially find fewer Fs. Non-native speakers of English are more likely to find the Fs. And this is because it exploits what naturally happens when we actually read. So I'm going to tell you again about a little bit more science. So native speakers especially will miss the F in the word of, right? Some of you might have noticed like, oh crap, I missed the ofs, and you have to still keep going. There's a couple of possible explanations for this. One is maybe that the F in of is actually a voiced labial dental fricative. It's not your classic fa sound. So that might be one explanation. Another is that the F is word final, meaning maybe it's a little bit, we're less likely to see it. And another one is the unitization hypothesis. And that means we read the word as a chunk, right? We don't actually read the individual letters. And there's a study done a very short amount of time ago, a very, very short amount of time, hardly any time at all. I believe it was about 27 years ago. But she did this study, and she was basically exploring like how we read. She was testing the unitization hypothesis. And this is well before the of text appeared on the internets. And her hypothesis was, that we do read some words as chunks. And she did a number of very simple experiments to test this. So what she did is she had her students read one of two texts. So in all of the experiments, students only read one version of the text. And one of the versions was prose, and that's like normal writing. That's when everything like looks fine. And then the other text was scrambled, where all the letters are in mixed up positions. And she asked her students to read the text in a normal way, in a normal speed, and to circle the letter T as they went. And what she found was people missed more T's in the prose text than the scrambled text. And maybe that's not surprising, because in the scrambled text, it's just a visual, like process, right? You don't need to do anything. But what she also noticed in the prose text, the T's in the word the were missed more often than any other word, right? So she's like, well, that's fascinating. She knew it was going to happen. Then she did experiment 2, and she's like, alrighty, maybe it's a pronunciation thing. We'll check it. So in this text, she used the word the and thy. So for those of you, maybe a lot of us know in this room, but like thy is basically Old English, and it means your, right? So I can say the book or thy book. Thy book would mean your book, right? And most native speakers of English would know that. We just know like, oh, okay, it's archaic. But it does mean that she could replace the with thy, right? And the grammar would be fine. T's in the same position. And in both of these words, the T is part of that grapheme that spells out that dental fricative, right? Okay, so she had text 1 with thes and text 2 with thys. And if it's a pronunciation thing, then we'll have no difference between the and thy. She had a whole bunch of students read these texts and circle the letter T. And you know what she found? There were more errors for the word the than for thy, right? So she's like, all right, it's not a pronunciation thing, but it could be a frequency thing, right? Frequency is very, very important. So thy is a very low frequency word in English. We don't really use it, right? Unless you're up in Yorkshire. I lived in Sheffield for 6 years, and like they were theeing and thouing all over the place. I was like, oh my God, I loved it. It was great. They're going down to the pub. All right, anyway. So maybe, like they were paying like a special attention to the word thy because it's like so unusual. So she's like, all right, let's do it. So she created 2 versions of the text, and she was using high frequency words like plant, comes up a lot, and low frequency words like yacht, doesn't come up a lot, depending on your lifestyle. I don't know. And so she had these words distributed evenly over 2 texts, and her participants read one of the texts. And again, she had them circling, the T's. And if this is a word frequency thing, we should see a clear difference between T's missed for high frequency words and T's missed for low frequency words. All right. And I also should say she was doing extremely good science. I sometimes use her paper as an illustration of really good experimental design. That's really important in psycholinguistics. The T's were in words that were the same length, and the T's were also in the same position of the words. And again, she had her students, do this thing, and surprise, surprise, they miss the T's in the high frequency words than in the low frequency words. So and her conclusion was that, yeah, we do have this unitization hypothesis. So words that are extremely frequent, yes, we do read these as chunks, right? Or are very likely to read these as chunks. So that scrambled Cambridge text, it cheats a bit. Like, yeah, we do kind of read words as chunks, but very specifically in certain contexts, right? So like, whilst I don't really like it, it does kind of show an interesting aspect about reading. I'm going to go over time. Are you all okay with me going over time? Okay, yeah. Thank you. How many of you are upset right now? How many of you are staring the hell out of that yellow 3? Like that yellow 3 had me hypnotized. Set you up there, didn't I? This is why when you're proofreading, you should always read out loud, right? Because when we read, we also correct mistakes, especially with the function words, because we jump right over them, right? It's also a trick for linguists. Like, we also know, like, there's different areas of linguistics. We study sound, phonology, we study words, morphology, we study grammar, syntax, but we also study pragmatics, right? And this is like language and interaction. And a question like this, you assume that the mistake is going to be here, right? It totally sets you up. And that's why I was like staring at that yellow 3. It had me so hypnotized. But yeah, that was kind of sneaky. All right, I can't remember what happens next. Oh yeah, I remember what happens next. Okay, so what happens next, again, I've seen this 1,000 times. It's on the Facebooks all the time. Read that. Yay.
It's readable.
How many of you feel special? Yay! Yeah, you're not special. Anyone can read that. Do you know why? Because it's leet. It was made for humans to be able to read, but not computers, right? So leet is a constructed text really built to full computers. So like when you're doing the CAPTCHA, that's something a human can do, but a computer really can't deal with. But you do find this kind of stuff on the internet, like, you're special, and I'm so sorry. A psycholinguist will tell you, you are so not special, right? There's this like regression to the mean every time. But there's a couple of experiments that kind of like play with this idea of using letters and numbers. So what Pereira and colleagues were interested in, they were actually interested in like neuroimaging and, you know, neurolinguistics and that kind of thing. They were interested in what parts of the brain process numbers and process letters, if they're different or the same areas. We're not actually interested in that because I'm a psycholinguist, not a neuro one, but we're going to use their experiment anyway. But one of the methods that they were using is called priming. And their question was, can words with numbers prime targets? I'll tell you what priming is. Priming is a classic psycholinguistics technique. It's basically what my whole PhD was about. But in priming, what we'll do is we're looking for a target word cat, and we're trying to manipulate how fast you respond to that word. We can speed you up, we can slow you down, we can also keep you at baseline, right? But if we want to speed you up, we're going to show you a related word before the word we're interested in. So dog and cat are related, and this is supposed to be like a semantic network here, like the semantic features that make up our knowledge of cat and dog. And of course, there's going to be a lot of overlap. We have that prototypical body shape, the body and the 4 legs. They're, you know, pets. We touch them. We know what they sound like. We know what they smell like, right? Good Lord. So like there's a lot of overlap there. And what happens in a priming experiment, if you see the prime word dog, you're going to be faster and more accurate to respond to the target word cat. This is in contrast to a baseline condition where you have the word cat, but you have an unrelated word beforehand, right? You're going to be a little bit slower. That's actually a fantastic priming effect of 50 milliseconds. I would die for that. I think my best ones are like 20 milliseconds. But you'll also be more accurate in this priming condition. So that's basically what they're doing. They're showing you a prime and then a target. And in this numbers experiment, what they did is they did a classic repetition priming technique. So that's where you see like the word and the target word, they're exactly the same. That's really, really well established. Then they did the leet prime for the target word, replacing the letters and the numbers. Then they used symbols, but the symbols were the same shape as the letters that were replaced. So what they're interested in is, can these types of words create that priming effect? Can they make people faster in responding? Because that would mean that we're using similar processing mechanisms for the recognition of these letters and these symbols, right, and these numbers. And of course, you need to have a control condition in any good psycholinguistics experiment. And here they used letters that had a different shape to the original letter. Lo and behold, they found priming for these three conditions. People were faster for the repetition priming, totally expected, has been well established. They were also faster with the leet condition and also fast with the symbol condition, right? So this gets into like letter shape a little bit. And if you think about it, it's kind of predictable. If you think about all the different fonts and writing styles that we encounter, we find it relatively easy to adjust to these and to read them. But I will say I'm trying to learn Japanese and katakana and hiragana. I'm really mad for a whole bunch of reasons, and I would love to see what would happen in an experiment using Japanese to see priming effects with the katakana that look exactly like other katakana. But that's my own private struggle. I'll spare you. So just to give you a recap of what you have experienced tonight, we talked about elephants from Denmark. Right? So like with word frequency, if you're asked to just like name a tool or name a color, you're going to pick a word most likely that's very high frequency, right? We have semantic impairments. Some linguists will look at this. Psycholinguistics usually looks at stuff that's going really, really well, but you do have your cognitive neuropsychologists who look at the way language breaks down, because the way language breaks down can tell us how it's actually built up, right? But with these semantic impairments, the frequency and prototypicality of the features can be really, really important. We talked about how we actually read, right? We can read some words as units. Sometimes we read letter by letter, and we can easily read with numbers. That's really not a big deal. And I told you about the priming effects that we can use in psycholinguistics to see if we can speed up your responses so we can see how different words and different concepts are related to each other. So yeah, so that's what a linguist does. We don't necessarily speak a bunch of languages. Maybe we do, but we can definitely tell you how they work. You got my references. If you want to fact check me, I highly recommend that. Don't believe everything you hear on the internet. And then if you're a serious nerd and you're really into it, these are all books that are written for a lay audience. I've really enjoyed all of them. And then the QR code will give you a link to a Lingthusiasm podcast that a student told me about. They're really, really fun if you're into that sort of thing. Thank you so much, and thank you for letting me go a tiny bit over time. And I can do